welcome again, everyone. This is the first in WES's online series of 3 lunchtime topics on meaningfulness in work, meaningfulness in the digital economy. Today's topic is about theorising meaningful work, and then on Thursday and Friday we will have follow-up sessions. On Thursday it's about meaningfulness and intersectionality, and on Friday it's about meaningfulness in the context of the platform economy. I'm going to be very brief. I will introduce the speakers and then I will give an overview of the structure and format of the session and how you as participants can engage and participate in the session. And hopefully we'll hear 3 interesting speakers and have some stimulating dialogue as well. So today's session, and I'm going to leave the speakers to introduce themselves and give you an overview of the topic. We've got Marjo Lips Wiersma, who's in Auckland, and I'm very grateful for all the speakers, but Marjo in particular, because it's midnight in Auckland as we speak. So Marjo is unable to stay for the whole session. So if you have questions related to Marjo's presentation, you take the opportunity to ask them immediately after her presentation. We've also got Katie Bailey and Knut Laaser. All 3 of the speakers have made significant contributions to academic debates on meaningfulness in work, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what they're going to say. I'm Professor Donald Hislop, based in Aberdeen, and I will be facilitating the discussion. So in terms of the session, once I've gone over this slide, I will pass over to Marjo to begin her presentation. She has 25 minutes, and then there'll be 5, maybe 10 minutes afterwards for Marjo to answer questions on her presentation. Katie is the second presenter, and there'll be 5 minutes of Q&A on Katie's presentation, and then the third presenter is Knut, and there'll be 5 minutes of discussion. And then once that is done, we'll have an open Q&A. In terms of how you ask questions, there's 2 ways, really. There's a Q&A function, which is the main function. We want, if you've got a specific question you want to ask, use the Q&A function, and the questions will appear, and I will find them, and then I will ask them to the presenters, and I will coordinate all the Q&A part. There is a chat function as well. Everyone can contribute to the chat function, which appears down the side. But primarily, if you have a specific question for a speaker, put it in the Q&A and I will pick it up there. Okay, that's enough from me. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides and pass over to Marjo to begin her presentation. Okay, over to you, Marjo.
Thank you very much, Donald. Here we are. Okay, so yes, thank you very much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. I really appreciate WES in itself as an institution, as the journal, and also the special issue on meaningful work, which has been really helpful to put meaningful work in a larger context and take it out of the psychology and organizational behavior field. Yes, my name is Marjo, and I'm a professor of ethics and sustainability in the business school in Auckland, New Zealand. My own interest really in meaningful work is very much between the micro and the macro, in the sense that I'm interested in topics such as spirituality, meaning, what matters to people, purpose. At the same time, for the past 25 years, long before it became a fashionable topic, I have taught sustainability in the business school, which here is a core topic. So all students, whether they're MBA, masters, or undergraduate students, have to take sustainability, and that is of course very much the big picture stuff. And so in my own own research and also in my own sort of thinking and in my own heart, I'm always thinking, how do you connect these things? How do you connect the micro and the macro? And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. Because I'm the first speaker up for the whole series, I thought I wanted to just talk a little bit about why now. Why do we currently have this intense focus on meaningful work and related topics, such as calling and purposeful organizations? And I found that there are more than 1,000 academic articles that have been published since 2010 and very few before that. So it is important to look at why is this happening. There have been several meta studies and review articles, several special issues, including that of WES, of JMS, Journal of Management Studies, Journal of Business Ethics, several edited books now, including the one that Katie edited together with Ruth Thiemann and some others, the Oxford Handbook of Meaningful Work, and also the American Psychological Association, Meaning and Purpose in Work. And there have been hundreds of popular books, podcast series, and applied tools. So it really is very much a burgeoning field. And like any field that is sort of growing, I'm kind of also wondering, at what point is a subject such as ours, which is very big and very encompassing, at what point can it become a harmful management theory? And of course, there are many different answers to that. From a critical management perspective, it would probably focus on that meaningful work like stress and so on is becoming very much an individual responsibility, very much individualized. We're being responsibilized, if you like, with finding our own meaningful work. Other criticisms have been that it comes from a positive psychology realm and hence has not focused enough on the barriers to meaningful work, but also not on other aspects of meaning, such as suffering. And also, can those who are searching for meaningful work, yearning for meaningful work, can that yearning be misused? For instance, there was an interesting article in WES about sacrifice-dependent organizations that, so many people looking for meaningful work are willing to sacrifice much more, possibly, and hence organizations, even their budgets might become dependent on that. Another criticism comes from the ethics perspective, which talks about, well, it's all very nice to have subjective experiences of meaningful work, such as, wanting high quality relationships, wanting to make a bit of a difference, expressing our talents, those sort of subject type of experiences. But we also need standards of meaningful work, objective standards as to what is good work, what is ethical work. Ideally, from my perspective, I think those objective standards would be set by a range of stakeholders rather than just the company itself. From a sociological perspective, we have more critique that organizational behavior and management theory can be decontextualized from what is happening in society, particularly in terms of overwork, undervalued, short-term contracts, all those type of things. And then, of course, from a meta theory perspective, what are some of the biases and assumptions, such as gender and ethnicity, that also creep into our theories of meaningful work. A colleague of mine, Ella Henry, just did a beautiful podcast on indigenous perspectives on meaningful work, and it takes quite a different angle from say my Western / Dutch / New Zealand angle on meaningful work. So at the same time, sorry to just go back, there is this thing of yes, a theory develops, then we can become critical of it, but that doesn't take away that humans do really yearn for meaning, and that partly they want to express that in their work. But in the last sort of 6 months, rethinking my research agenda a little bit, I've also been wondering what we're actually really yearning for. And this is not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to just spend a little bit of time on what we're actually yearning for. And I think one of the yearnings is around acting in the world, which Viktor Frankl talks about, meaning is, the importance of acting in the world. And that is against a background where many people feel disconnected from valuable projects and ask, like our students do, how do I contribute, to the bigger issues of inequity or unsustainability. It also expresses itself in what we now refer to as the silent middle. People that would like to contribute to the debate but are often silent. It can also express itself in apathy and overwhelm, eco-anxiety, all those type of things. So how do we not just yearn to make a difference, but connect ourselves to the important projects? And I think there is a sort of a gap there at the moment. I'm always reminded in that context of my parents, who were farmers in the far north of Holland. And at that time, if they wanted, say, a tennis court or something, the community wanted a tennis court, they would just turn up with a whole series of diggers and start digging a tennis court. And not that we all need tennis courts, but the point is that there was a real ability, more ability for certain people at the time to act in the world. And I am definitely not going to argue for a more deregulated society, but there is something about the urge to act and whether we can actually, whether we can actually fulfill that urge. A second yearning, I think, is a meaning bridging the different values and approaches. I think meaning and meaningfulness, by definition, requires us bridging different values and approaches. But while we have that yearning, and while humanity is growing up and we understand issues of inclusion better, and stakeholder inclusion, etc., I do think that we also have the yearning for this type of meaning against the background of polarization. So again, there's a sort of a gap between our yearning and where parts of the world are heading. Then this is an oldie, of course. That meaning has always been associated with prerequisites or antecedents of dignity and autonomy. But there are issues at the moment of, the power of those of us who are laboring against the background of increasing power of the capital. And so again, do we collectively actually gain more autonomy or less autonomy? Some people in the meaningful work field, such as Joanna Schuler, talk here about bogus empowerment. We feel we're being consulted. We need to be consulted all the time. Being consulted is taking up quite a bit of our time. But does anything we say actually make an impact in large organizations? And finally, we're seeing a lot of meaning through organizational purpose, and increasingly organizations needing to have a purpose beyond profit. But this is also against a background of unsustainable business models in a broken economic system. So again, there is a gap between our collective yearning and the and other things that are currently going on in society. So I was kind of then wondering, what kind of work, paid work, might meet this yearning against these sort of backgrounds that I have described. And as I said, there's, I think, quite a lot more that we could be talking about here. And I thought, well, either work needs to be structured so that we have time and energy to be citizens. so that we can spend time outside of our paid work hours on these bigger topics. But even if it was structured in this way, would our time not be taken up by caring or, other things that we are spending our time on, basically? And also, is work actually distracting from and almost, taking away from us learning to be citizens again, when so much identity is tied up with work these days, and work is so central to so many people's lives. And so then I thought, well, the other side of that is, of course, that within the work time, we actually encourage people to be more like citizens, so that we can feel that we can tackle some of these bigger issues. And so rather then I thought, well, this is a case study that I often use in my sustainability teaching. I thought, well, what then can this look like? What can citizenship in the context of organizations actually look like? And I just wanted to give you some examples. This is also, I want to say, from a paper that Ruth Yeoman and myself developed, and was rejected for the Journal of Business Ethics. But I still think there's some worthwhile exploration in this whole topic of citizenship, against the background of what kind of meanings we are yearning for. So if we look, for instance, as meaning as acting in the world, I thought I'll just give you some quiet time to read this. So I think, in terms of creating citizenship and teaching citizenship and engaging employees in citizenships, Patagonia does a really good job in connecting those within and outside of the boundaries of Patagonia to civic action and formalizing this. I think this is quite different, to be honest, from volunteering. I've looked at some research on volunteering and worked with some people who do research on volunteering, and organizations who receive these sort of half-day volunteers who want to do something good sometimes find that they have really been helped, but often also found, somebody told a story about a donkey refuge where refugees place, where actually a bunch of people from a large accountancy organization that we shall not name, just turned up basically an hour too late in their suits and then kind of went, so how can we help? And sometimes that sort of volunteering is actually not that meaningful for the organization and takes away meaning. The people who were working there actually felt that they were not seen and not appreciated by that sort of volunteering. Whereas I think this sort of civic action is a significant step beyond that. Meaning as bridging different values and approaches. And again, I'll just ask you to read this. And I think this idea of actually expanding, what we can talk about as being meaningful rather than having it defined by the corporation, which sometimes I feel feels like gaslighting. Basically, you can talk about these meanings, and as soon as you talk about some other meanings, it's like they're not seen or heard at all, and then that in itself makes work meaningless because we cannot really act as fully fledged human beings and citizens, and so that is another way of looking at meaning at the boundaries of the organization in relation to citizenship. Another one is around the third issue in terms of what we are yearning for is autonomy and changing ownership. And again, if you can just read this example. So at one level, there is, I think, significant autonomy within companies such as Patagonia, and there are many others that we can think of. Many were published in Laloux's book of Reinventing Organizations, where organizational hierarchies are sort of turned upside down. I would say that I think employee ownership and employee profit sharing schemes would be a very good idea. I mean, I don't think Patagonia is perfect, but there are different ways of looking at autonomy, I think, beyond empowering people in organizations, and meaningful work literature seems to focus a lot on that type of empowerment rather than more structural forms of autonomy and dignity in organizations. Again, and then a wider register of meaningful relationships, more permeable boundaries. And again, I just wanted to give you some examples here. And I think you can, again, I hope you can see this sort of difference between people making a bit of a difference through the organization, which certainly from a sustainability perspective, some people, of course, obviously very much do through social enterprises, and some companies are at the cutting edge and really much more in a circular economy and those type of things. But at the same time, there is quite a lot lacking in terms of people really being citizens, participating, and really helping to reshape society. And because that's really what citizenship is about. How do we collectively reshape society? And these type of initiatives, I think, get people to focus above the here and now and much further into the future as to what society they collectively want to create as citizens. And finally, in terms of meaning through purpose, so some of you might, I don't know, I'll hear that shortly, whether you think this is too far out there, whether they are too politically engaged, etc., etc. But I do think that that is going to be a big question around meaning in organizations when we look at the central concept of citizenship. Well, the other side of the debate is, of course, that most corporations are already politically engaged through lobbying, but also, how overtly in relation to your own employees can you be politically engaged, and should you be engaged if you want to encourage citizenship? So, to me, the causes of meaninglessness and the explanation of much of the current yearning for meaning is in a range of systems issues currently facing humanity. And systems issues require making a significant and lasting improvement to underlying structures, to policies, practices that contribute to a particular issue or problem. Instead of merely addressing symptoms or offering short-term solutions, systems change aims to transform the very systems that perpetuate those problems. And to be honest, and I am part of this, so I can say this, I'm part of writing often in the context of organizational behavior, but I do think what we do there, or in the context of psychology, is often merely addressing the symptoms through our meaningful work literature. So we need to connect people to systems change through citizenship, which is why I would argue that is central to meaningful work and life. And therefore, the meaningful work agenda needs to include citizenship and how we encourage citizenship, basically. So
Thank you very much,
that's
Marjo.
pretty much what I have to say, Donald.
That's fantastic. You get a gold star, Marjo. You're perfectly on time. I love speakers like you, who don't need warnings and signals to. So it's now time for questions. Oh, I've got a question popped up. Let me check. Patagonia is very much a poster child for purposeful organisations. What can or should regular organisations do to help enable greater citizenship?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and my students often say things like this as well. Of isn't Interface or Patagonia or all these organizations that we then pull up as examples, aren't they poster child? So my first answer to that would be that I think there's three movements going on at the moment. One of them is the great unraveling, where there are a whole lot of organizations that if you want meaningful work, I don't think you should work for. Secondly is business as usual. And I think the person who's asking this question is asking about how do we include citizenship in business as usual, which will do some eco-efficiency, maybe pay people a bit more of a wage, but not a living wage, etc., etc. And I think there is traditional forms of citizenship that people have always had in those type of organizations, like union membership, like reaching beyond the organization and influencing politics, etc., etc. And at the same time, I do think, and I know that there are groups in organizations who are looking at how do we actually exercise more citizenships in these business as usual kind of organizations, which can be be for profit, but also not for profit. We should not just associate that with corporations, because of course with new public management, well, we know it in universities, for instance. So, you know, and then I think the third thing, yes, there are organizations like Patagonia, but they're certainly not the only one that are much more radically transitioning, and yeah, in which we have more opportunities for citizenship. And these organizations are not doing badly. So yes, there are, you know, and you all know other sort of mechanisms that we've talked about, you know, in terms of how to get more autonomy. But the focus of my talk is really what would you like to use it for? And I think we need to get much more of a notion of citizenship, which is much more at the boundaries of the organization than maybe within the organization itself.
Okay, thank you. I've now got another question, again on the Patagonia example, but maybe a bit more critical. So I'll read out the question. It's quite a long question, but I think it's worth reading out in full and giving you a chance to respond, Mario. So it says, it's from Eliza. Thank you for the presentation, Mario. Really insightful. I'm hoping not to have misunderstood the key points, but I was wondering whether there is any validity in thinking that attribution of meaning to good doing, citizenship of companies such as Patagonia is problematic from a theoretical perspective. While it does provide the workers with meaning in their work, does this necessitate harms such as marginalisation, oppression, suffering of others, just so we can feel fulfilled at work? I hope this makes sense. Thank you, Eliza, for the question. Any thoughts,
yeah,
Mario?
I think it makes absolute sense. I don't think Patagonia would be an example of organizations doing harm, but I certainly think that organizations can be as patronizing as individuals can be, in terms of deciding for others, you know, how they're going to make a difference to their lives, which is why I very initially said that ideally, I think when we look at purpose and meaning through purpose, that this would include really including all stakeholders in deciding what is meaningful, rather than possibly a few privileged stakeholders. So from a social and environmental sustainability perspective, I would definitely say that a lot of our search for meaning actually does harm. And to maybe add something, I'm currently doing some research on, for instance, sustainability officers, and it's almost as if their search for the immediate need to make a difference might do harm to some of their long-term necessities, sustainability necessities. So I think there are all sorts of contradictions, but I don't think necessarily that Patagonia itself is an example of that, which is not to say it's perfect. But then that's a whole other issue as soon as we go to meaning and those sort of topics that are that I think we need to really engage, as Patagonia itself does, with the complexities and the imperfections, etc., that it's not just, you know, 4 bullet points of getting to making a difference.
All right, thank you very much, Mario. Before I ask the next question, I think a couple of people have raised hands. Excuse me. With the format we're running this meeting, participants aren't able to speak, just the panelists and chair. So if you want to ask a question, you need to put it in the Q&A or the chat, okay? I've got another question in the chat, Mario. Is within a few minutes, this might be difficult, but it says, it's from Ambika. Could you share the research on Indigenous perspectives on meaningful work here? It sounds very interesting. I mean, I don't expect you to be able to summarise it in a couple of minutes, but can you point towards any links or publications or?
Yes, yeah, I'm very happy to post that. So we incorporate indigenous perspectives in all our sustainability and other teachings in New Zealand. At the same time, and so I could speak to that, at the same time, we're very aware that it's much better if indigenous people themselves speak to it. So I much rather post a link of my colleague of a podcast on indigenous perspectives on meaningful work, which is a bit like what I was doing as well, in that it's much more an outside-in perspective. What does society need, and therefore what could work possibly potentially look like, including probably changing our economic systems.
Thank you. If you were able to post that link in the chat, Marjo, that would be great.
Yeah,
I've got.
I'll find it while Katie
sure.
is speaking. Yes, yeah.
All right. This is the final question. It will have to be from Anna. Thank you very much for the great presentation. You talked about meaning as acting in the world, with the example of Patagonia giving employees the time to pursue civic duties to feel connected. To what extent do you think the type of activism the organisation and its employees pursue needs to be related to the core essence and purpose of the organisation in order for this to influence the sense of meaningful work for employees?
I'm not entirely sure whether whether the question is, are there certain organizations through which you could never express citizenship because, more from the ethics critique, that the objective of the organization itself, and for some people that might be mining companies, for others they might be related to alcohol and smoking. We have whole sets of criteria, of course, within sustainability and sustainable investing, which those who are completely denying human rights, etc., whether one should ever pursue a citizenship through those. And my personal, if I was to answer that to say my son, I would say, please don't, and spend your citizenship. Make sure that you carve out enough time to be a citizen, if you have to work for companies like that, to be a citizen outside of those. I think it's a complete waste of time. But other people feel that they can change organizations from within.
Okay.
And yeah.
All right, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. We'll need to leave it there because of time issues, but thank you very much, Marjo. Thank you for the contribution. Thank you for staying up late into the evening to do it and be part of the session. And if you're able to post that link, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, I'll go and hunt for it. Thank you.
I'm now going to pass over to Katie, who's got a presentation for you.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to be here. I'm Katie Bailey, and I'm Professor of Work and Employment at King's College. And I am also Professor of Leadership and HRM at the University of Northumbria. Marjo's got our session today off to a fabulous start, and I was so interested with some of the ideas you raised there about citizenship in relation to meaningful work, Marjo. So thank you very much indeed for those thought-provoking ideas. So I'm conscious that the theme for today's session is about theory in meaningful work. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the multiple perspectives that have developed over the years in relation to meaningful work, and then move on to talk in a little bit more depth about one particular study that Marjo was involved with, along with our colleague Adrian Madden as well, that we've recently published in the journal Human Relations, where we've tried to bring together different theoretical perspectives around meaningfulness, and to perhaps make the case that given where the field is now, maybe we should be looking to bridge those theoretical divides more in our work in order to really advance our understanding of meaningfulness. So one of the things I started to do when I was preparing for today's presentation was to think about, well, I need to provide a definition of meaningful work. So I started writing down on a piece of paper some of the words that were being used in the definitions of meaningfulness that I came across. And there was just more and more and more words that seemed to be important in definitions of meaningful work. And I think this really does reflect the multiplicity of different perspectives that have been used. In a recent review article that I was involved with, we found, for example, 28 different scales of meaningfulness that have been developed just from a quantitative perspective. And that's setting aside some of the other angles that have been developed. But I think if you take each sort of broad theoretical perspective that's been used on the topic of meaningfulness, we can see different clusters of words and concepts emerging. So, for example, if we take some of the ethical perspectives that have been developed around the topic of meaningfulness, and Marjo mentioned some of these, we see words like the ones I've circled here coming to the fore. So some of the questions are, you know, what are the objective conditions of work that we need to see in place if work is to be seen as meaningful? What's the link between those objective conditions and the subjective experience? Can we find a link between the two? To what extent does one matter more than the other? What are some of the virtuous dispositions that are developed in people as a result of pursuing meaningful work? And what is the moral duty of organizations to provide meaningful work, and indeed for us as individuals to pursue work that has meaning? From the more psychological OB perspectives, and again, Marjo mentioned some of these as well in her talk just now, the focus is very much on the subjective experience of meaningful work. So meaningfulness as an attitude towards our work that is driven by a set of antecedent factors, which might be things like job design or leadership style, which then lead to a certain range of outcomes. But in having these kind of conversations within the OB psychology perspectives, we're then missing out on some of the other perspectives that are important. For example, if we look at it through an ethics lens, around the link between society and societal factors, such as Marjo was talking about just now, and our own individual experience of work. So the psychological perspectives have been very much aligned with what Lepisto and Pratt talked about as the realization perspective on meaningful work in their paper, which is a paper I keep going back to, and I really found to be very, very enlightening. In other words, meaningfulness is about something that we find in our work, something that is related, an individual experience that relates to how we view our working context, the design of our jobs, the leadership that we have, our relationship with our colleagues. It's something that we find in our work. The more spirituality perspectives consider perhaps a different range of issues in relation to meaningfulness. So here the emphasis is very much on how can work provide and meet the needs that we have for a spiritual dimension to our lives? How can work bring us joy, enable us to express ourselves, and link us to things that are more important than ourselves? So it's very much here about self-transcendence and the greater good. Finally, some sort of the sociological perspectives, and I think that probably Knut is going to go on to talk about these issues more in his talk in a moment, is looking at the link between the objective conditions of work and the subjective experience. So what is happening at a broader level within society, within the organization, within the structure of employment, within the economy, that then influences how work is set up and established, and our own day-to-day experiences of that work. So this has often been referred to within the papers that have drawn on the Lepisto and Pratt model as the justification perspective. So the focus here is on how do we make a worthwhile contribution? How do we find something significant in the work that we do? So as you can see, a lot of these different perspectives focus on different words, different concepts, different theoretical domains in relation to meaningfulness. And we've seen huge advances within each of these separately. But I think, as I mentioned earlier on, now we've perhaps got to the point where we need to start linking these together a little bit more to think about how meaningfulness can be developed as an overarching concept that will help us perhaps to address some of the problems that Marjo raised in her talk just now. But one of the one of these kind of intersections that we became very interested in the research that I did with Marjo and with Adrian was around this notion of a worthwhile contribution. So in all of the different perspectives on meaningfulness, this idea of making a contribution seems to come to the fore. It seems to be important from a sociological perspective, a psychological perspective, this sense that we are making an important contribution to others, to the world around us, through the work that we do, if we're to experience it subjectively as meaningful. But this is a kind of a problematic concept. And if you look at the literature within the meaningful work field on contribution, you can see that it actually is one of the core conundrums. We're not actually very clear what we mean by a worthwhile contribution. And it's not just a question that matters to us maybe as academics here, but also matters to us as individuals. So I think all of us, as we go about our work, have probably asked ourselves the same kind of question that our participant, Ewan, who's a musician, asks here, you know, what's the point of any of this? Why do I bother? Am I contributing anything? I think we've all had days like that, whatever the work that we do, even if we're in the kind of work that we're lucky enough to do as academics, where we're able to do interesting work, where there should perhaps be a sense of contribution coming from it, more easily perhaps than other types of work. But this notion of contribution does seem to be fairly core to meaningfulness. Alan and colleagues came up with a useful broad definition of contribution as the global judgment that one's work accomplishes significant, valuable and worthwhile tasks that are congruent with one's existential values. But what's not clear is actually what this entails. So Martella, in his recent theoretical paper, made the point that, well, contributions can vary. You know, making a customer smile, is that a contribution? Or do we have to look at the really grand contributions like serving humanity? Christopher Michelson pointed out a few years ago now that most jobs don't actually require us to run towards danger, to put ourselves in the firing line, literally or metaphorically, for other people. So how do we know if we've made a contribution? And to what extent does it matter whether that contribution is important to other people or is it just to us? So there's a lot of ongoing uncertainty around this notion of a contribution. So we turned in our paper to the French pragmatic sociological theory developed by Boltanski and Thévenot about the orders of worth. And some of you may be familiar with this framing. So one of the things that's useful about the Thévenot and Boltanski framework is that they propose that there are different orders of worth, and each of these relates to some higher common principles of legitimacy. So we're not just looking for perhaps one way in which work can make a worthwhile contribution, but there are different ways. And these are established discursively and in contested ways as we go about our work, so that there's a constant sense of clash between these. So for example, the domestic order of worth puts kinship to the forefront. It's about relationships with other people, caring for other people. Civic worth is about the common good, you know, what is best for society. Whereas industrial worth is about efficiency, doing things properly and to the right standard. And their point in developing this theory was to show that actually people can revert back to different orders of worth when claiming legitimacy and contribution of their work. So their theory was, of course, developed to look at higher level entities than the individual, but nevertheless, this notion of orders of worth has started to be applied within the meaningful work literature, and we found this to be very useful for our paper as well. Now, I mentioned just now that one of the things that Boltanski and Thévenot emphasize is that the sense of contribution is something that is established discursively and in conversation and in the things that we say. And this is very resonant with the notion of put forward by Lepisto and Pratt in their work, which is that meaningful work, the sense of meaningful work is basically arises from accounts and stories that we tell ourselves that justify the worthiness of work. So this really very much inspired a discursive approach from us. So what we wanted to do was to look at these discursive processes, not even so much what people say, but how they say it, how they put their accounts together in order to justify the value and meaning of their work. And what could this reveal about meaningful work itself and the nature of what a contribution is? So we did a qualitative study where we looked at three occupational groups. We had nurses, creative artists, and lawyers in our study. And we did an interview-based study. And the analysis that we did was inspired both by critical discourse analysis, but also by narrative analysis. So what we did was we broke down the stories that people told us in their interviews about times when they found their work meaningful, or when they felt that kind of struggle and challenge to find meaning in their work, and how they put those stories together. So we were looking for breaking those stories down into discursive units, but also looking at an overarching way at the kind of overall narrative that they were putting forward in their stories. And we could see, looking at the three groups, that they had slightly different ways of talking about their worth. And one of the things that was very clear to us was that each group struggled in different ways to find that sense of meaning. Now, nurses, I will say a few words about the nurses first of all. So nurses, you would perhaps expect to more easily find a sense of meaning in their work, because we look at the medical profession as very much, it's fairly clear to us as outside that profession what a contribution that they're making. But if you talk to nurses and also to maybe to doctors as well as and other groups, actually there's a real daily struggle to secure that sense of meaningfulness. So here the stories that we were told were very much about the nurse having to act as gatekeepers for the patient. And we've got this quote here from Anne, which very much encapsulates what a lot of the nurses were saying. So they felt very much caught up between the doctors on the one hand, who wanted to come up with medical solutions to the problems that people were facing, and the hospital administrative functions, which were very much concerned with getting the patients through and out, freeing up the beds in the hospital so that they could then bring more patients in and keep the cycle going. So here the nurses were very much laying claim to a sense of worth in their work through being the advocate for the patient. So speaking up for the patient, that sense of closeness and proximity to the patient, and acting as their real guardians in the face of others who didn't understand them. So we were looking at the claim to worth, this subject position, so where each of the people put themselves in their story. And then we were looking at the identity set. So who did people talk about when they talked about the challenges perhaps of their meaningfulness, but also who could act as sources of meaningfulness. It was very much here, it was other medics, hospital bureaucracy, using the discursive resources such as empathy with the patient, feeling close to the patient, proximity, depersonalizing others who were kind of getting in the way of that sense of meaningfulness. So depersonalizing the hospital administrators as those upstairs, and firewalling, so carving out a space for themselves where their concern was the patient and they didn't need to think about the medical side of things from the doctor's perspective or the resourcing side of things from the hospital administrator perspective. So from their point of view, the important thing was to be close to the patient, to understand the patient and to advocate for the patient. Now, of course, all of these different claims to worth and struggles going on a daily basis take place within a broader framework. So we were interested in discourse with a small d, as well as discourse with a big D, so ideology. So what was the ideology, the societal ideology around the occupation that people kind of internalized and represented in the stories they told? And the ideology here was very much that nursing is a virtuous occupation, although that was contested somewhat in other cultures, but certainly here in the UK, it's a virtuous occupation. So that lent weight to their claim that actually they were making a contribution. but the struggles emerged very much over who had the right claim to worth. Was it the doctors? Was it the hospital administrators? Or was it the nurses themselves? And this then prompted the nurses to very much look towards the little things that they did day to day, rather than perhaps making grand claims to worth based on their occupation as a whole. And this idea of these little things actually was evident in the stories we heard from others as well. So in the terms of the creative artists, and here we spoke to musicians, actors, writers, singers, and so on. And very much here, we got a sense that it was very difficult for them to have that feeling that their work was making a worthwhile contribution. Fundamental to their claims to worth was this notion of inspiring other people. So the artist is maybe the outsider coming in and opening up the doors to people to see the world in a different way, to experience life differently because of having their eyes opened through their creative art. And in setting themselves up as to where they were making their contribution, they talked about, you know, the arts as a whole and the importance of the arts to society. Funding bodies. Who did the funding bodies give their funding to? Often it wasn't them, the ones we were interviewing, it was other people. And so other creatives were also important in terms of them positioning themselves within the field. And they drew on all sorts of interesting discursive resources, and one of which was a claim to be very lucky. You know, I'm very lucky that I've been able to do this. I feel very privileged to have been an artist. But at the same time, this sense of luck and privilege was a source of this ongoing discursive struggle that they felt about the value of the arts in general, but also of their art in particular. There was very much a fear of selling out, just doing popular work for the sake of it, in order to earn more money, as opposed to doing work that you feel truly to be inspiring and that is authentic to you. And that's reflected here in the quotation from Ewan, where he talks about he'd done this amazing written this amazing piece of music that he loved, but he didn't know how to get it to people, and he didn't feel it was appreciated, and drawing on comparisons with others who they felt really had sold out in order to make more money. And finally, the lawyers. So here, very much the claim to worth was vested in this idea of being the purveyor of justice, with the lawyer as the crusader. This particular law firm were very much representing the individual claimants against organizations. So they positioned themselves as, I'm the crusader fighting for the little person against the big corporations. And they looked very much to the law, other legal firms, to get that sort of feedback and a sense of where they were in relation to their field. Here they were looking very strongly to the professional logic, the moral virtue of hard work. They talked a lot about the sacrifice they'd made of their time and energy to get to the position that they had, and the hard work that they'd had to put in. However, it was very clear that there was an ongoing struggle about how much does the law actually matter. We had several participants saying, well, actually, I'm a bit embarrassed to say I'm a lawyer. People perceive us as kind of fat cats. And there was a sense that people didn't really feel that they could lay a very strong claim to being undertaking worthy work and making a strong contribution. So these were our three occupational groups, and we drew a few general conclusions from our study. The first one was that we identified 3 dimensions of worthwhile contributions. So the first of these was people have to say to themselves, does my work make a contribution that I judge to be worthwhile? So the individual themselves had to feel that the contribution mattered and made a difference in order for it to be seen as a worthwhile contribution. It wasn't enough for other people to judge it. The individual had to judge that way themselves. Then they needed to feel that their contribution was judged and acknowledged externally by other individuals, by others in their identity set, by wider society, by what they considered to be appropriate standards. So in other words, where people felt that others were judging them inappropriately. So if you were judging someone from the domestic order of worth, whereas actually what mattered to you was the fame order of worth, you would dismiss those other claims because that didn't fit within your preferred boundaries and order of worth. So people look very much at what they consider to be the right standards. And for that reason, people were able to reject feedback from others that said that actually your work doesn't really make a difference. And then finally, there was the self-efficacy argument about the ability to make a worthwhile contribution. So does your work put you in a position where you're actually able to make that contribution? So the stories that we heard pretty much all coalesced around this heroic narrative. So the person coming in, breaking through, doing the things that really mattered and making a difference in the face of criticism, contestation from others. But because it was so problematic for people to sustain this idea of a hero narrative, often people look towards the very little things that they did, these kind of micro contributions through their daily work, in order perhaps to protect themselves from some of the criticisms that they faced. So I think I really enjoyed working on this project with Adrian and Marjo. It was a challenge at times, but I think one of the things I particularly valued about it was the fact that we were able to go some way towards starting to build bridges across different perspectives, bringing in a discourse perspective on meaningful work, looking at a contribution from both the realization and the justification perspective, and starting to think about how all these things connected and coalesced around this idea of a worthwhile contribution. So thank you very much indeed for listening. And yes, have you got any questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. Again, very, very well on time. So gold star for you too. I've got a question up already. Thank you. Up from Irena Dragulis. Real interesting presentation. I'm delighted you started with the objective conditions of work, but you soon shifted from them. Meaningful work is an important area for research, but many meaningful employers, particularly charities and voluntary organisations, have very poor reputations as employers in terms of pay, working conditions, etc. There is extensive bullying, low pay, intensification of work, all justified because there is a higher cause. Is there a danger that the meaningful work literature neglects workers' terms and conditions?
Oh, yes, what a great question. Thank you, Irena. And it's lovely that you're here as well. I wish I could see you. Yes, that's a very, and that actually links in with what Marjo was talking about as well. And I expect it also links forward to what Knut is going to talk about in his presentation as well. And I do think it's a danger and a risk that we cannot be overlooking the sort of more objective conditions of work. And I think that's why Knut's work in particular is very welcome, because you very much, in your work, Knut, that I've read, you're very much building these bridges across different perspectives, which is hugely valuable. You're right in your critique of our work, Irena, when you say that, yes, perhaps we didn't do enough looking at the objective conditions of work. It was something that we did take into account in the paper. And I think also, as always, with the constraints of a journal article and lots of different theories to talk about and so on, we weren't able to go into it perhaps as much as we would have liked to. I think that would be a great topic actually for a future study, and I very much hope that might be something to look at next time. I think one of the things we did look at, and I didn't say too much about it for time reasons, was the link between at societal level ideologies, sort of what Alverson and Karaman call the big D discourse, and experience of meaningful work. So we were taking very much a discursive perspective in the paper, and that was something that we did look at. What did people think that society thought about their work, as well as what did they think the people they worked with and for, what did they think about the work? So we were trying to look at it from a discursive perspective. But I think more research that takes into account some of these objective conditions of work will be a great way forward for the field.
Right, thank you very much, Katie. So another question from Hazel Hislop. Are there specific evidence that links to meaningful work are gender specific. That is, are there differences between men and women in the approach to meaningful work? Very interesting question.
Yes, that is a very interesting question. We didn't look at gender differences in this particular study, but there has been research on gender in relation to meaningful work, and I noticed that Marjo is still bravely still here. I think I would have gone by now, but I can see her there still. And I know Marjo has written a paper where she's looked at blue, white, and pink collar workers. We did have a paper as well in our book, the Oxford Handbook, which looked at gender. But papers on gender and meaningful work are few and far between. But I do know of a few people who are actually, as we speak, working on this, looking at intersectionality and meaningful work, and other aspects of demographic differences and meaningful work. And in fact, you've got a session later on in the week, I think, as part of this series where you look into these. So I don't want to put Marjo on the spot, but I don't know, Marjo, if you want to come in and say something about what you found.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is and you talk about that already in regard to our paper, is externally in terms of the discourse, and internally versus people then valuing the work, and obviously a very obvious one with regard to gender, that you and I wrote about, Katie, in another unpublished paper, is around, for instance, women's work, women seeking work in order to make a difference, often, such as caring work. But then, of course, society values that less. So I think there are some really important political issues with regard to gender and work and meaningfulness. And the other thing, that was in that special issue around these organizations being so dependent on people sacrificing because their work was meaningful, was also mainly women sacrificing.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And you have now reminded me about that paper, which we started working on and hasn't as yet been published, which was looking at meaningful work in the context of gender. And yes, there's much to be written about that. And as you say, Marjo, there is this risk of stereotypically women's work getting undervalued in comparison with men. And another theme that we looked at was the link between the sort of vertical and horizontal segregation of employment and meaningfulness. So that one of the questions we posed in that paper, which we never really were able to answer, was, do women get fewer opportunities to experience meaningful work because they get excluded from opportunities, for example, if you access to less promotion opportunity than their male peers? So does that cut off some opportunities for women to experience meaningfulness? And also the fact, as you say, Marjo, women get still clustered into certain types of occupation. And does the devaluing of some of those occupations compared with more male-dominated work, does that then also make women's experience of meaningfulness lower or more challenging than men? And indeed, do women seek meaningfulness in different aspects of their work compared with men, through valuing different orders of worth, for example, if we want to look at it that way, as compared with their male colleagues? So there are many, many interesting questions around that. So thank you for raising that topic.
All right, so thank you. Maybe that's something we can come back to in the wider discussion if other people want to think about that. I've got a couple more questions, but just because of time, so that we've got time for open discussion, I'm going to cut and paste those questions and bring them in at the end. So Jess, and I'm not sure who the final question is, I will bring those questions in at the end. So I'm going to pause the Q&A for Katie, but thank you very much for the presentation, Katie, and your responses. I'm going to hand over to Knut now, who will talk and then answer some questions on his presentation, and then in the remaining time we'll have an open discussion. So over to you, Knut.
Yeah, thanks, Donald. It's up to me now to break with your timing expectations, but I guess I should be within the 25 minutes mark. And if not, I'm sure you will let me know. Right. Okay. Yeah. So I started to engage with meaningful work a couple of years ago. And initially, I had mixed feelings when I encountered contemporary approaches to meaningful work. I was aware of Hackman and Oldham's classical approach to meaningful work, who popularized, so to speak, meaningful work as a sort of job attitude in the organizational behavior literature. And then over the years, I realized that there are contemporary approaches who picked up meaningful work again, and it became a thing. And I had mixed feelings when I saw that, and probably that comes with a discipline, because as a sociologist, and I know many other sociologists that are skeptical of the term because they're skeptical of waged work, so to speak, and they have a sort of love-hate relationship with waged work because of the many constraints it features. And Arena has made reference to that. And before then, before I engaged with meaningful work myself, I did read John Butt's work on the sort of work, which is, I think at least, a fantastic work on different approaches to the concept of work, and he kind of structures different disciplinary perspectives on work. And I realized that, first of all, sociology is not the only discipline that has a really problematic relationship with waged work, for good and not so good reasons, but also other disciplines, humanities especially, do have a very ambivalent relationship to work. And his book also acknowledged and highlighted that work viewed from different disciplines also offers a source for human flourishment and social cooperation in a society. At least it has the potential, and that it can actualize people's capacities. And that work then led me to engage more deeply with modern meaningful work discourses. And I realized that my skepticism was maybe not appropriate. So from that perspective, I started to work on meaningful work and started to go through the work of Axel Honneth, Catherine Bailey's work, and Ruth Geomann's work. And these three approaches, they come in from very different perspectives. I would say Ruth Geomann and Axel Honneth are more skeptical about the capacity of meaningful work under capitalism. And Catherine Bailey, at least my reading of your work, is that you do see opportunities for meaningful work in modern work organizations, while also, of course, opportunities for meaningless work exist in parallel. And that then made me wonder if is there an opportunity to conceptualize from a sort of labor process perspective meaningful work, acknowledging the contested terrain of work and the workplace, while also acknowledging that there might be episodes or constellations where waged work can be meaningful. And this is the reason why I then started to develop at first a sort of framework of meaningful work that explored whether meaningful work can be found in low-skilled work. And that was the first paper. And the first paper was published in the International Journal of Management Review. And there we reviewed different perspectives on meaningful work, a bit like John Butt's work, according to the discipline. And then we distilled different categories from this very diverse scholarship and combined it with labor process theory and employment relations theories, and came up with 3 dimensions that can make waged work meaningful if they are actualized and enabled in modern workplaces. And these categories, we labeled them core autonomy, respect for recognition, and derived dignity. So these definitions, and I will come back to these 3 concepts a bit later on, where I redefined them with Jan Carlsen. But essentially, these 3 dimensions are highlighting subjective dimensions of meaningful work that are created by workers at work and designed by them in order to appropriate and humanize their work and establish practices and orientations at work in opposite to the formal organization and managerial practices. So in a way, it was inspired by Ackroyd and Thompson's organizational misbehavior, because core autonomy, respect for recognition, and derived dignity was trying to establish meaning, even though in the formal organization there was a lack of these dimensions. But in contrast to Ackroyd and Thompson, we don't think, or we didn't thought at that time, that the dimensions like extending autonomy is basically just to create a space of their own and push back management. But we thought they do that because they want their work to be purposeful, and they want to own what they're doing, and they want to own their relationships at work, which even in low-skilled work can become and make their work then meaningful. And in that way, we conceptualize meaningful work as a bottom-up practice. That was the beginning of then what I did with Jan Carlsen later on, which developed into a more full-fledged, I would say, sociology of meaningful work that goes beyond just the subjective dimensions and establishes or tries to bridge the subjective practices workers engage in to make their work more meaningful, and the objective conditions that create an environment in which workers can engage with their work in a way that allows them to appropriate their work, so to speak. And I guess that is our unique, or that's a unique idea of that theory, because I'm just jumping to the first dimension, because we don't think that objective characteristics, and the first one being autonomy, that autonomy at work, which we define from the objective perspective as opportunities for workers to exercise skill and judgment throughout different stages. So a pretty standard definition, I think. We don't think that on its own is enough to experience autonomy. It just creates the opportunity, which then can be exercised by workers when they establish, and I guess that is the uniqueness of our theory, when they have a worker collective, we call it, relationships at work that appropriate their work through the establishment of bottom-up values and norms, that then allows them to develop an orientation to their work that is their own and create over time an independent meaning system. So these two types of autonomy are related, but they're independent, so to speak. They shape each other, but they can exist even though, so the objective can exist, but the subjective might be absent. So even though workers have job discretion, job autonomy, there might be no worker collective for different reasons. The work might be individualized. In some sense, in some cases, call centers are an example of that, but not always. The gig economy might be an example of that, but then again, there are exceptions to that. So for the subjective dimensions, there need to be a worker collective, according to our perspective. And that is true for dignity and recognition as well. And dignity, again, we suggest that dignity is objectively existent when formal organizational and employment practices uphold workers' dignity by meeting norms of respect and civility. So we rely here on Andrew Sayer's work, and Paolo Donati also provides a fine definition by saying work has dignity objectively when it's tailored towards the skills and potentials of the worker and is sufficiently complex. And again, we say that's an important element, but it becomes only powerful when the worker collective is able to own these structures and practices, and but by self-initiated practices that allow them to derive dignity, worth, and respect as part of their worker collective, as part of a community of workers that decide discursively over time what practices they, how they approach certain practices and how they do it and when. And the last point is recognition, which we primarily suggest happens when the employment conditions are fair and just, so equal and adequate pay, for example, when working time is not in conflict with other life goals and commitments, if there are representation rights, and if there is a participation in planning and decision-making at work. And subjectively, we say that in the worker collective, workers experience recognition when they establish over time rules and practices that allow appreciation and admiration. And appreciation is, and this is what my co-author worked on for quite some time, appreciation is in a way how horizontal relationships grant respect for everyday practices and processes based on workers' own values, and knowledge of what it takes to do the work and what knowledge it takes, what physical burdens the work takes. I remember, for example, Katie Bailey's work on refuse collectors. At least I could read into that, the appreciation aspect being a very important dimension. And admiration equally important because it establishes that there's a hierarchy as well in the worker collective, and that the hierarchy is based on different things, but essentially skills and also contributions to the worker collective, and that people who invest more time in the worker collective, support others, are admired for that and receive recognition. And now, just checked how I'm doing time-wise, but since I'm not hearing anything from Donald, I guess I'm doing fine. So we had these 6 dimensions, 3 objective, 3 subjective. And what we did then is, because what I tried to do also was to provide an alternative to what I considered a rather static understanding of meaningful work, which basically was often defined in the scholarship by either you have meaningful work or you don't, right? And so there was nothing in between, and that irritated me, because I know from my working life and from other case studies and colleagues that almost no one would consider their work all the time meaningful. And rarely do people consider their work all the time meaningless. So there must be something in between. And again, Katie Bailey and others, unfortunately, I can't pronounce her name well, but a colleague from Amsterdam, Luzovia, suggested, for example, that meaningful work experience can be temporal, change throughout the working day. And so that is one way to bring some flexibility and dynamic into the meaningful work understanding. But we thought we can also bring some dynamic into it by suggesting there is something in between meaningful, meaningless, and what is in between is a sort of struggle over meaningful work in different ways. And this struggle is represented by the different combination of these dimensions. And essentially, we developed a range of scenarios. And the most obvious two scenarios are when all the dimensions are met, you have strong and balanced meaningful work. Then you have the worker collective, you have great employment and working conditions. Unfortunately, I do think there's almost no workplace that offers, or where you can find that, very rarely at least. And then if none of these dimensions are present, then you have the absence of meaningful work, which is basically meaningless work. But then the question was, what happens in between? And this is why we had weak and unstable meaningful work, for example, where we thought when only the objective dimensions are present, so objective, autonomy, recognition, dignity, work has good conditions and enables the person to learn a lot. The pay is good. But over time, it will be not a stable experience of meaningful work, because the worker collective is missing, and the worker collective is, for us at least, a social dimension that appropriates the objective conditions and bridges it and translates it into the subjective experience and defends it in case of organizational restructuring or change. And if work becomes too intense, becomes intensified, the worker collective can buffer it through different means. And therefore, even when the conditions are great, we consider meaningful work there being only a temporary experience and unstable. And the other scenario that I want to briefly mention is constrained meaningful work, where we say when, is that what I want to mention? Yeah, so when you have objective autonomy and all, but not objective recognition and dignity, but you have a strong worker collective and therefore these subjective dimensions are active, then you do have an opportunity, and we consider that more meaningful, if you want to measure that in some way, as weak and unstable meaningful, because the worker collective translates and appropriates spheres of work, and even though the objective conditions of recognition and dignity are not strong, the worker collective finds a way to subjectively establish practices and mechanisms that allow people to experience their work as strong. And therefore, that allowed us to understand meaningful work as a dynamic and combine it with the contested terrain approach to the workplace, where there's always a struggle over the interests of the employer and the interests of workers. And sometimes they overlap. Sometimes there's conflict, or actually there's quite a lot of conflict usually. But the worker collective, if it's present, allows workers to create alternative sources of meaning and defend it over time. Now, I think I'm kind of doing okay, so I want to wrap it up before I'm getting reminded that I'm over the time. So what I think the theory offers is that meaningful work is something that needs to constantly be sustained actively. It's not something that can be defined bottom up and then be experienced. Neither can it be just experienced by the individual, at least from our perspectives, for a longer time. But it needs that social hub, that community of workers that translated then into their understanding of the work and its culture and values. And since the nature of work is changing and new technology is coming in and conditions change and become more problematic in some areas and in others become better, it allows us to capture these changes and transformations and look closely into how people struggle to maintain meaningful work or create meaningful work. And I think it does allow also to understand the job satisfaction paradox, where it was always basically said, why do workers in under not ideal conditions are often more satisfied with their work than employees in an environment where that is very providing privileged conditions. And I think our perspective on that is because often the worker collective is stronger in these conditions, in areas where the job conditions might not be as privileged, but where workers work together more closely and have the opportunity to create these subjective dimensions. Yeah, self-references. So yeah, most of what I talked about is covered in the WES paper, and we then revised it and extended it in that book you see on the right, which is out for a couple of months now. And there we extend and embed it in wider discourses. So yeah, thank you very much, and looking forward to the questions if there are any.
Okay, thank you very much. On time as well, so no need to worry about times. I've got a question that's been sent to me by Shoba, and she starts by saying, this is your framework's been very useful for researching meaningful work, so thank you. But the question was, in your framework, you've got objective and subjective dimensions. Is there any space for what Shoba calls intersubjective dimensions of meaningful work?
Well, the way I understand intersubjective is captured by our subjective dimensions, because the worker collective is essentially an intersubjective accomplishment where people over time share their values and offer intersubjective recognition. So we do, I didn't put a lot of references to social theory that we used in these slides, because that would become very messy, but we do draw a lot on Axel Honneth work on recognition. And there, I would say Axel Honneth is, at least in his recognition theory, he's quite prolific when it comes to intersubjective forms of esteem and self-worth exchanges. So I would consider our subjective dimensions being basically, being based on intersubjective accomplishments, but maybe your understanding of intersubjective is different, then you can let me know and we'll have a chat.
Any more questions for Knut? I've got one of the questions carried over from earlier, so I'll ask this just now. So Katie, you might want to come in. Well, this is from Jess, and it starts with a compliment. It says, "Thanks very much for the presentation, Katie." And then the question is, and this is either for you, Knut, or Katie, what about the darker side of meaningful work? Is there any evidence that that experiencing work as meaningful leads to overwork, stress because you care so much about the work and it means so much that you work excessively and get stressed, etc.? Either of you want to come in on that?
You want to go first, Katie, or should I?
No, you go first, Knut.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I do think our theory does capture that, which basically, I think I'm still sharing my screen, right? Right, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the scenario where only the objective dimensions are present is representing basically what you are asking about, at least from our perspective, where the objective conditions are excellent and the employee has job autonomy and basically a lot of enablers for meaningful work, but the work is more or less individualized, and that in our perspective is in danger of putting people at risk, that they become overwork and over identify with their work, because there's no corrective, so to speak. There's nothing that embeds the work in a sort of regulative framework, like the worker collective, which doesn't mean that there can't be overwork when there's a worker collective present, but it is less likely and it can be buffered more. This is why I would respond to it.
Mute.
Well, I'll just come in there, shall I, Donald, and just
Sure.
say a couple of words. And I did notice a couple more questions have come in for Knut just while he was speaking there in the Q&A. I don't know if you've got those. But yes,
Yeah, no, if you want to respond to the dark side, Katie, and then I'll come in with Knut's questions. Okay,
yes, very happy to talk about the dark side. Yeah, so we didn't specifically look at the dark side of meaningful work in our paper, but I do completely agree with the question, which is that this is a terribly important aspect to think about in terms of meaningful work, whatever theoretical perspective you're coming from. There is quite a bit of literature out there, of course, both within the callings literature and within the meaningful work literature, which talks to this debate, and that there's a clear consensus that if you can have too much meaningfulness in your work. There were some papers in our special issue of the Journal of Management Studies back in 2018 or 19, where we had some fantastic papers from authors who looked at this issue in the context of both volunteers and paid workers, talking about the sort of the sacrifices that people that then come to make if they find their work too meaningful. And then you've got papers like the Bunderson and Thompson paper going right back, looking at zookeepers putting too much into their work. And I do think that this is a very important consideration. We tend to hold meaningfulness up as an ideal to which we should all be aspiring, and we want all work to be meaningful. But actually, and I think this is something that needs more research, not everybody wants meaningful work. I've spoken to quite a few people who talk about moments in their work that they found meaningful, but overall their life outside work is much more important to them than their life as a worker, and we need to find a way of reconciling that and of theorizing that and understanding it in the models, frameworks, and the research that we do, I think. So, thanks. I'll hand back to you, Donald, for those two questions for Knut.
All right, thank you. All right, so I've got a question for Knut from Eliza, saying, thanks for the presentation. As a sociologist who falls into the category of sceptical of waged labour, Your talk was very hopeful and appreciated. Have you found any examples of work that tend to fall in the in-between of the extremes? Would you say there are professions that commonly fall in those other two categories?
So not the meaningful or meaningless category, but I guess the struggle one and the contested one. Yes, we do capture that in the book, where we didn't have space in the article for that, so we extended that, and we have case studies for each scenario in the book. And we did find, for example, I did early on in my academic career, I did research on bank work, and for me that was an example of struggle over meaningful work, because bank work became individualized, basically, to make it very short, with performance management practices and new technology. And their workers did struggle with the worker collective that was left to maintain practices that they considered meaningful. So relationship with customers that became very technological mediated. They found ways to bypass technological constraints, and they shared these practices among themselves and kept it quiet or away from management as much as they could. We did find for each scenario case studies or did research on them that fit the threshold of them. And yes, that was the one that I remember just now.
Okay, thank you. Right, so one more question for you, Knut, and then I'll open it up. I've got 2 or 3 general questions for both of you. So this is from Marek. He says, thanks for the presentation. It's quite a long question, so apologies, Marek. I'm going to just abbreviate it a bit. One issue that could have been more directly addressed in your book is whether meaningfulness pertains primarily to the process of work or to the ends of work. Any comment on that? Is meaningfulness, is it more about the process or the outcome of work, or is it both? Or how would how would you respond?
That's a toughie. Well, I guess
Marek's good at these type of questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark, for that. Well, I'll just give a cheeky answer. It depends. It depends on the workplace. So I would say if you take the work of academics, then I would. It's a tough one. I would say often it's about the process, but certainly if we look at care workers, it's about the outcome as well. But to be on the safe side, I would say it's about both. And at some points in time and under certain constellations, one trumps the other in its importance for meaningful work. But basically, it is something that needs to be identified but by looking at the case study. But I also agree that we didn't make that distinction clear enough, and that we should do that in the upcoming works that we do on meaningful work. But yeah, thanks for that.
All right, thank you. Right, so I've got a couple of questions which I can go to either of you. So I'll come to you first. I'll ask this question for both of you, but I'll come to you first, Katie, for an answer. Because this is something that the question was directed at Knut, but I think it's relevant to you both. Talks about disciplinary perspectives. You both make reference to different disciplinary perspectives. And the question is, I'm a doctoral student working on my literature review, and I observe that some studies do not fit neatly into each of the disciplinary labels, as often studies are interdisciplinary. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how you navigate this. Thanks. Katie, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, yes, well, thank you for your question, and I understand that that was primarily aimed at Knut, but I do agree with Donald as well that this is a general issue for the whole meaningful work literature, and it's something that I did in my presentation. I divided, you know, ideas up into according to different theoretical perspectives, and it is extremely difficult. I remember when we wrote our review paper, which we had published a few years ago now. It was 2018, I think. And we had to divide the literature up in order to find a way of presenting it. It was, you know, we had so many discussions about how to divide things up and where to put things, because a lot of it is interdisciplinary or just not clearly within one camp or the other. So I think the way that we navigated it in terms of in terms of our review paper was we tried to cluster things. So we tried to, and I'm sure there's a more technical, whizzy way you could do this, where you use IT to find out which are the core papers and then see which ones are then linked in with those core debates, and then work out from there. We did it in a rather more sort of manual approach to doing that, where we found clusters of papers around certain themes. And so we presented those clusters while also being aware that actually it's not that easy to divide things up in that way. And so I think it is a tricky issue. Probably Knut had a better way of doing it in his paper.
No, we did the same.
Yeah,
yeah, sorry. Yeah, we did the same manually, and we had a lot of discussions. I think right now we had then in the book, and I think in the review article as well, lots of tables where we then identify papers and whether they can be categorized under what we call political philosophy. Ruth Geomann's work, we consider that, for example. But yeah, the boundaries. I mean, usually most of the papers don't categorize themselves on what perspectives they are taking, and I think that is pretty normal. And since meaningful work itself is also, at least from my perspective, a very interdisciplinary, a multidisciplinary concept. Even you will find rarely articles stating what discipline they are coming from or where they situate their theory and what disciplines they situate their theory in. So yeah, it's a tough one to do. Good luck with it.
Okay, so I've got two questions, two kind of really interesting questions, very different, which I'll use these to sort of finish off the session. So this is an anonymous contributor. How does the influence and rapid development of digital technology such as AI, which has significantly impacted on daily life and work, impact on meaningfulness in work? Thank you. A very big question. Either of you would put your hand up to come in first?
I'll just say a couple of words. I mean, this is not really my area of expertise, but we recently did a special issue together with Evgenia Lysova, Christopher Michelson, and Jen Tosti-Karas and some others within the Journal of Business Ethics on the future of work and meaningful work and technology and ethics. And there were quite a few articles in that special issue that looked at this very issue. And I think one of the interesting things was that there were, you know, both advantages and disadvantages from a meaningful work perspective. I mean, on the one hand, you could argue that there would be examples where the meaningfulness of people's work is taken away by it being automated. But on the other hand, there's the potential for more mundane work to be taken away, to free up people's time and effort to focus on the more creative, interesting, maybe meaningful aspects of the work. So I think thinking about the papers that we had in the special issue, I don't think there was a very clear consensus about exactly what is likely to happen, but it's certainly very important for meaningfulness.
Okay. Knut, any thoughts about AI and meaningfulness in work?
Yeah, it's not my area either, but I agree with what Katie said, and I think it depends how AI is used and in what workplace and how the workplace or the work was organized before and how AI changes that. And I think there is no trend or tendency whether it contributes to more or less meaningful work. From my perspective, I would say it depends also on the worker collective and whether there is agency when it comes to how to implement AI in the labor process and how to use it, and whether it disconnects people from each other or whether it is used to maybe complement or support work tasks that were never workers' favorites before. So it really depends, I think, on how it is implemented and how the profession deals with it, so to speak.
All right, thank you both. So second question, which is for either of you, both of you, does meaningful work as a framework translate into different social and economic contexts, such as societies where there is little choice available to people about work, and most jobs will not meet basic standards of quality of work?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Well, if I was to rephrase it, is it difficult to achieve meaningfulness in work where people have very little choice about what jobs they do, and the quality of the jobs are very low? Okay. Is that just a kind of I don't know, utopian idea in that type of context?
Yeah, I just respond quickly to that. No, I don't think it's a utopian idea. I do think there are genuinely workplaces where people experience meaningful work for different reasons. One of them being, as I said, the worker collective. And but I also acknowledge that it does differ across industries and differs across the global north and global south divide, and that working conditions in the global north are relatively privileged in many areas compared to these of the global south, and that there is not much research, in fact, on meaningful work in the global south, which I think is going to be addressed in the coming years. But no, I don't think it's an utopian idea. I do think, and Ruth Geoman said that, I think, very well in one of her papers. She considers meaningful work as a stretching goal for organizations, something that we shouldn't give up on, even if the conditions for meaningful work aren't present at the moment. Meaningful work provides us with a framework to pinpoint what is wrong in these environments and suggest what can be done to improve these conditions. So it can be utopian, but I think in many cases it's not. And I think if you have a dynamic approach to meaningful work, you can show the different areas where it's lacking or where there's struggle over.
All right, thank you. I think the question, if I'm interpreting it right, is really about meaningfulness, say, in the global south. Is that possible to achieve it? Any thoughts, Katie, on that question?
Well, I think this is an incredibly important question, actually. And I think, as you say, we do need more research sort of globally into this issue. There was a very interesting paper recently, and I can't remember who the author, I can't remember what the journal was. I think it was the Academy of Management journal. It was a qualitative study of rag pickers in India. And that was about the meaning of work, how they constructed the meaning of their work rather than specifically meaningfulness. But that looked at the way that they balanced kind of meaningless experiences with meaningful experiences as they went about their work. And that was a very interesting paper, looking at just that sort of population that you're talking about. But we do need more research on this. And I think not all jobs, in whichever part of the globe they might be situated, offers these opportunities for people to find meaningfulness. However we define it and whatever perspective we're taking, not all jobs are either objectively or subjectively meaningful. And I think it's a question, and I think it's one that Marjo posed right at the beginning about, we need more opportunities for work to be meaningful, and how do we actually do that? in whatever the context.
All right, thank you. I have an observation, if I can abuse my position as chair on this about maybe not global south, but jobs where kind of routine work, etc. I'm a bit of a movie buff, and there's a film, a Japanese film called Perfect Days, been released last year, and it's about a toilet cleaner who's exceptionally happy, and he's found a way to a life philosophy which he uses in his work. I would definitely recommend that film to anyone. It's a beautiful film, but it connects to this thing about finding meaningfulness in life and in work, and what might be regarded as a mundane or sort of dirty job. So anyway, well, I can see that we're coming close to the end, so I don't want to. I've put a link in the general chat to everyone. The film's called Perfect Days. Perfect Day, I think. It's the Lou Reed song. When he drives his van, he plays the Lou Reed song all the time. So thank you very much, Knut, Katie, Marjo. Hopefully she's sound asleep now. I really appreciate your willingness to come and speak. I've really enjoyed it myself. I hope everyone has as well. Thank you for the contributors for coming along, for the stimulating questions. If you've really enjoyed this, come along tomorrow, come along on Friday. It's the same time, 1 till 3 p.m. Tomorrow, it's about meaningfulness and intersectionality. So we touched on that a little bit today. But thank you, everyone, for coming, but particularly to the speakers for your willingness to devote time to this very important topic. And I appreciate your contributions. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, all, and have a good day.